The lights of the studio burned hot, the kind that makes even seasoned politicians shift in their seats. The audience sat in rapt attention, eyes fixed on the stage where two figures embodied the clash of eras. Bill O'Reilly, veteran of bombast, leaned forward with that familiar scowl carved into his face. Across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, posture calm but eyes alive with conviction. She had been building her argument, voice steady, when suddenly it happened. O'Reilly's voice cut through her words like a blade, sharp, loud, and dripping with arrogance. "Stop. Stop right there," he barked, his hand slicing the air as if swatting away a fly. His interruption wasn't subtle. It was dominance theater, the old trick of talking over a woman to remind everyone who he thought held the authority. Gasps rippled through the room. A few nervous laughs broke out, as if the audience couldn't quite decide if what they heard was real. Camera zoomed tighter. Whispers curled through the crowd. O'Reilly had just tried to silence Jasmine Crockett, mid-thought, mid-sentence, mid-truth. The insult hung heavy in the charged silence, like smoke after a gunshot. The entire room froze. Had he really just tried to shut her down? O'Reilly smirked, leaning back in his chair, clearly believing he had seized the upper hand. For decades, his booming interruptions had been enough to derail guests, to throw them off balance. He knew the playbook. The audience knew the playbook. It was dominance disguised as debate. But Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fumble for her notes or stumble into silence. She didn't bow to the performance of authority. Instead, she drew a slow breath, lifted her gaze, and fixed it on O'Reilly with a composure that was more unsettling than any shouted retort. Her stillness carried weight, the kind of weight that makes an aggressor realize, too late, that he may have picked the wrong target. The audience shifted, sensing something was about to break. Crockett's lips curled just slightly into a smile that wasn't humor so much as certainty. She was ready, but what she fired back would instantly flip the power dynamic on its head. This wasn't just another heated exchange on television. It was a battle being played out on a national stage, in front of millions who tuned in not only to watch the clash of personalities, but to witness a deeper struggle, one that has defined American democracy for generations. Bill O'Reilly wasn't simply a man with a microphone. To many, he represented an era when media giants could silence inconvenient truths with volume, swagger, and the illusion of authority. His interruptions had long been weapons, his platform a fortress built on control. Every time he cut someone off, every time he belittled a guest, he reinforced the message. The gatekeepers of information decide who speaks, who matters, and who gets to finish a sentence. And across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman who had clawed her way through the barriers that O'Reilly symbolized. She didn't come from the protected world of elite punditry. She came from the neighborhoods where voices like hers were often drowned out. To see her on that stage wasn't just representation, it was a declaration. She embodied a rising generation of leadership, one unafraid to challenge the bluster of the establishment and demand that silenced voices be heard. America itself seemed at a crossroads in that moment. Was this still a nation where the loudest voice in the room, usually older, whiter, male, armed with decades of unchecked privilege, controlled the conversation? Or was this the era when new voices, forged in the fires of lived struggle, began to command attention on their own terms? The tension in that studio mirrored the tension across the country. Families sitting at dinner tables debated the same question. Who gets to define what America is and who belongs at its center? O'Reilly's interruption was more than a personal slight. It was symbolic of a larger effort to push back against progress, to remind challengers that the old order still believed it ruled the airwaves. And yet, the cameras captured something different in Crockett's silence, in her refusal to be rattled. It wasn't just about defending herself from insult. It was about defending the principle that no one's voice should be bulldozed by arrogance. She carried with her the weight of communities who had been told to wait their turn, the generations told to keep quiet while others defined their future. Everyone watching could feel it. This wasn't just about one man trying to cut off one woman. It was about whether power still flowed top-down from the media elite, or whether the people, through leaders like Crockett, could seize the narrative for themselves, and the stakes were even higher than anyone realized. Because what Crockett was about to say wouldn't simply put O'Reilly in his place. It would ignite a spark that would leap beyond that studio, carried across timelines, hashtags, and conversations at kitchen tables. It would turn a single interruption into a national reckoning. The silence before her words was heavy with anticipation. Everyone waited. The question hung in the air like a storm cloud. Would she let herself be diminished, or would she rise to define the moment? Her answer would prove bigger than herself. It would send a message about democracy, dignity, and identity. A message America desperately needed to hear. For decades, Bill O'Reilly was more than just a television host. He was a cultural force. Night after night on The O'Reilly Factor, he transformed the studio into an arena where his voice reigned supreme. He didn't interview so much as he dominated, wielding interruptions like weapons and barking down any guest who dared to deviate from his script. Viewers knew the routine. O'Reilly would lean forward, raise his hand, and with a sharp tone, cut off anyone mid-sentence. To his loyal audience, it was proof of strength. To his critics, it was arrogance dressed up as authority. This tough guy persona wasn't an accident. O'Reilly carefully cultivated it, branding himself as the unfiltered truth-teller who had no time for political correctness or opposing viewpoints. He would sneer, roll his eyes, and thunder with the certainty of someone who believed that the louder voice always won. For years, that formula worked. He wasn't just a host, he was a kingmaker, shaping conservative discourse and casting himself as the gatekeeper of what America should think. But beneath that towering image lay a shadowed history. O'Reilly's career wasn't just built on confrontation. It was scarred by controversy. His aggressive style often blurred into cruelty. His gotcha questions more about spectacle than substance. And then came the scandals that eventually tore him down. Reports of harassment, settlements, and a culture of silence around Fox News finally erupted into the open, shattering his empire. Once untouchable, O'Reilly was suddenly out, his throne toppled, his legacy stained. Yet even in his fall, he never abandoned the persona. He clung to his brand of intimidation, convinced that his sheer force of personality could still bend others to his will. When he interrupted Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't merely an old habit resurfacing. It was O'Reilly reaching for the same lever of power that had once kept countless voices muted. He was trying to remind the world, and himself, that he could still command the stage. To the untrained eye, it looked like a simple clash between a host and a guest. But to anyone who knew O'Reilly's history, it carried establishment weight. He wasn't just a man cutting off a congresswoman. He was the embodiment of a media system that had long silenced voices like hers. His bark carried with it decades of institutional arrogance. The idea that the gatekeepers of the airwaves could decide who spoke and who stayed quiet. That arrogance defined O'Reilly's career. He had built a reputation not on dialogue, but on dominance. He would declare, "I'm looking out for you," to his viewers. But the truth was clear. He was looking out for control. He thrived on manipulation, turning complex issues into sound bites, painting dissenters as weak, and rewarding obedience with airtime. It was a stagecraft that worked for years, until America began to change. The rise of new voices, new movements, and new platforms challenged the old order. Communities once forced to the margins found amplification through social media, activism, and leaders like Jasmine Crockett. They didn't need O'Reilly's permission to speak. And yet, in that studio moment, O'Reilly was still clinging to the belief that he could silence them with one bark, one interruption, one flash of his tough guy persona. That's what made his clash with Crockett so symbolic. Here was a man representing the old guard, the bluster, the manipulation, the arrogance of media elites, trying to put a stop to a woman who symbolized everything rising against it. The interruption wasn't just rudeness. It was a last gasp of a fading empire, an attempt to reassert a power that had already begun slipping through his fingers. The irony is that O'Reilly's own downfall had been a lesson in silenced voices finally breaking free. The scandals that ended his Fox career were the result of women refusing to stay quiet, refusing to accept the narrative he had long controlled. In a way, his history was already a mirror of what was unfolding before him, a reminder that no matter how loud he shouted, truth eventually found its way through. And yet, O'Reilly hadn't learned. His attempt to cut off Jasmine Crockett wasn't just the arrogance of a man stuck in his ways. It was the arrogance of an establishment figure who believed the rules of the past still applied. He embodied more than his own ego. He embodied the manipulation of a media culture that had told America for too long who was worthy of being heard. What O'Reilly didn't realize was that times had changed. The audience wasn't leaning forward to hear him anymore. They were leaning forward to see if Crockett would answer back. And when she did, the silence that followed was no longer his weapon. It was hers. Before the cameras, before the fiery congressional hearings, before she squared off against Bill O'Reilly, Jasmine Crockett's story had already been written in grit, resilience, and an unshakable sense of justice. Hers is not the tale of someone groomed by the political elite or born into power. It is the story of a woman who clawed her way through barriers, each obstacle forging her into the unflinching force America would one day see standing her ground on the national stage. Jasmine Crockett grew up far from the marble halls of Washington. Her upbringing was rooted in the realities of everyday people, families who worked hard, struggled harder, and rarely had a voice at the tables where decisions about their lives were made. From an early age, she carried with her the lessons of resilience, watching firsthand how communities like hers were too often overlooked, dismissed, and silenced. While many children dream of wealth or fame, Crockett dreamed of fairness. She wanted a world where people who looked like her, lived like her, and fought like her families did could be heard. Her path to leadership was neither smooth nor welcomed. In school and early in her career, she encountered the stereotypes that shadow so many women of color, dismissed as too loud, too angry, or unqualified. But instead of shrinking, Crockett leaned into her voice. She embraced the fire others tried to extinguish. In debate teams, classrooms, and later in courtrooms, she learned how to turn their dismissals into fuel. Every time someone underestimated her, she sharpened her arguments. Every time someone tried to talk over her, she learned how to command the silence until it worked in her favor. Her activism was not born in ivory towers, but in the streets, community centers, and courtrooms where injustice was raw and visible. Before Congress, she was a civil rights attorney, standing up for those crushed under systems designed to keep them voiceless. Police accountability cases, voting rights battles, tenants fighting eviction. Crockett became the lawyer people called when the system said no. She was relentless, not because the cases made headlines, but because they made a difference. Each client, each fight deepened her conviction that justice wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity. That tenacity carried her into politics. But even there, the attacks followed. She was told she wasn't polished enough, that her style was too brash, that she didn't fit the mold. Yet Crockett never wanted to fit the mold. The mold itself was the problem. She was not running to appease the establishment. She was running to disrupt it. Her rise to Congress was fueled not by corporate donors or political dynasties, but by the people who saw in her something rare: authenticity. She was unbought, unbossed, and unapologetically herself. On the campaign trail, she didn't just shake hands and pose for cameras. She listened. She walked into neighborhoods politicians usually avoided, sat with the overlooked, and asked the questions most leaders were too detached to consider. What do you need? What has been taken from you? How can I fight for you? That's why she resonated. She wasn't a manufactured brand. She was the real thing. And in a political landscape crowded with rehearsed lines and empty promises, her blunt, fearless honesty cut through like a blade. In Congress, her voice only grew louder. She gained a reputation for speaking truth to power without hesitation. When colleagues attempted to corner her with veiled insults or outright disrespect, she met them head-on, never flinching, never softening her words to make others comfortable. Clips of her fiery exchanges spread across social media, not because she sought attention, but because people recognized in her a reflection of themselves. Tired of being silenced, tired of being told to wait your turn, tired of being underestimated, Crockett became more than a congresswoman. She became a symbol of the new guard rising in American politics. Leaders who were not polished puppets of corporate America, but raw, relentless fighters for the people who had been ignored for far too long. She was proof that the voice of a black woman from a working class background could stand shoulder to shoulder, or even above the titans of media and politics who had dominated for decades, and that's what made her confrontation with Bill O'Reilly so powerful. To many watching, it was a tense television moment. But for Crockett, it was the culmination of every battle she had ever fought. Every dismissal she endured, every stereotype she broke, every attempt to silence her that only made her voice stronger. It all led here. When O'Reilly barked his interruption, it was more than an insult. It was an echo of every moment in her life when someone tried to shut her down, to put her in her place, to make her believe her words didn't matter. But Crockett was no stranger to that sound. She had heard it before, survived it before, and learned how to turn it to her advantage. What O'Reilly failed to realize was that Crockett wasn't just a politician on his show. She was the embodiment of the people he and others like him had tried to silence for decades. She carried with her not just her own story, but the stories of millions who had been dismissed, underestimated, and told to stay quiet. When she spoke, she wasn't just defending herself, she was defending them. That is why she resonates so deeply. She is fearless not because she's never been afraid, but because she's had no choice but to fight through fear. She is unbought not because money hasn't tried to sway her, but because her integrity is rooted in the people who gave her power. She is the voice of everyday people because she has lived their struggles, carried their burdens, and turned them into her mission. So when the clash came, when the cameras rolled and O'Reilly tried to silence her, Jasmine Crockett didn't just respond as a congresswoman. She responded as the product of every battle she had ever fought. Every challenge, every insult, every attempt to erase her had prepared her for this exact moment, to stand tall, look power in the eye, and refuse to be silenced. Because for Jasmine Crockett, the fight has never been about herself alone. It has always been about proving that when one voice breaks through, millions more can follow. Bill O'Reilly leaned in, his voice booming with the same force that once dominated primetime cable news. He cut across Jasmine Crockett mid-thought again, his words sharp and dismissive. Hold on. You don't know what you're talking about." The interruption was deliberate, a trademark move perfected over decades. His fans called it tough questioning. His critics knew it as silencing. And now, in this moment, O'Reilly wasn't just interrupting a congresswoman, he was trying to reassert the authority he once wielded as an untouchable media giant. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't frown, didn't scowl, didn't even lean back in irritation. Her posture remained steady, her eyes locked forward, her body language radiating the one thing O'Reilly could not rattle: composure. She sat upright, her hands calmly folded in front of her, and in that silence, her refusal to blink became louder than O'Reilly's bark. The tension thickened. The studio air seemed to shrink, pulling the audience tighter into the clash. Some viewers at home likely nodded in agreement with O'Reilly. He was, after all, their fighter, the man unafraid to call it like it is. But others leaned closer to their screens, recognizing in Crockett's stillness a quiet power, a deliberate strength that refused to be bullied. O'Reilly pressed on, louder, faster, trying to smother her point before it could take shape. "Congresswoman, you're dodging. You're spinning. You're not answering the question." His finger jabbed at the desk for emphasis. To him, this was the script he'd always written: overwhelm the guest, dominate the exchange, declare victory. But Crockett was rewriting the script in real time. She tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture that conveyed both patience and defiance. She let him run, let his words tumble over themselves until they lost their sting. Her silence was not weakness. It was strategy. She was timing her moment, preparing to speak with the precision of a scalpel rather than the bluster of a hammer. The room was divided. On one side, murmurs of agreement with O'Reilly's jabs. On the other, a swelling sense that something was about to shift. The clash wasn't just a battle of words anymore. It was a battle of poise, of who could command the moment without losing control. O'Reilly leaned back, smirking as if certain he had won. "See? She can't even respond without dodging. Typical." His voice carried the arrogance of a man who believed his interruption was the final word. But Crockett's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus. Her lips pressed together for a breath, then parted as she leaned forward at last. Her stillness broke, but not in the way O'Reilly expected. There was no frantic rebuttal, no desperate defense. There was only the steady cadence of a woman who had endured far worse than a raised voice on live television. "You finished?" she asked, her tone calm, almost gentle, but edged with steel. The audience gasped. The power dynamic flickered. For a brief moment, the cameras seemed to freeze on O'Reilly's face. his confident smirk faltering under the weight of Crockett's restraint. It was no longer just a debate. It was a duel of identities, of histories of what America itself was wrestling with. O'Reilly represented the old guard, loud, overbearing, convinced that control of the conversation equaled control of the truth. Crockett embodied the new, measured, unbought, unwilling to yield even when the room tilted against her. Every eye was now fixed on her. Every viewer leaned forward. And in that pause, the question lingered heavy in the air. Would Jasmine Crockett let O'Reilly's attempt to silence her slide? Or was she about to strike back with the kind of precision that would flip the entire exchange upside down? Everyone braced. The silence before the storm stretched thin, electric, waiting for the crack of thunder that was sure to follow. The pause after Jasmine Crockett's calm, "You finished?" lingered like a storm cloud. Bill O'Reilly chuckled, expecting her to stumble, to backpedal, to scramble in the way so many others had under his glare. But instead, Crockett leaned forward, her voice low and steady, like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Because if you're finished, Mr. O'Reilly, then maybe it's time the truth had the floor." The room shifted. Conversations hushed. The camera zoomed in, capturing her unblinking eyes locked squarely on the man who had built a career by shouting others into silence. And then, with surgical precision, she began. "You've spent decades yelling over people, decades pretending that volume equals truth. But let's be honest, it doesn't. It never has. And it never will." O'Reilly stiffened, smirk flickering. He tried to interject, but she lifted a hand slightly, just enough to signal she wasn't done. The gesture wasn't forceful, but it carried the weight of command. The audience responded with a murmur, as though they could feel the axis tilting. "You accused me of dodging questions. Let's talk about dodging accountability," Crockett continued. Her tone was steady, paced, each sentence dropped with the rhythm of a hammer striking nails. "Because when we talk about who's been dodging, let's remember, you didn't walk away from your perch at Fox because you wanted to. You left because the truth finally caught up with you." Gasps rippled through the audience. O'Reilly's face tightened, his jaw clenched. His old tactic, interrupt, deflect, shout, hung in the air, but something in Crockett's calm made him hesitate. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't his weapon. It was hers. She leaned in closer. "You want to lecture me about credibility? About service? Well, I've been out here fighting for everyday people. People you've dismissed, mocked, talked over. You were busy cashing checks off outrage. Off fear. Off division." A pocket of applause broke out in the back row, hesitant but undeniable. O'Reilly shifted in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk, his confidence cracking. "And let's be clear," Crockett said, pausing deliberately, letting her words breathe. "You can bark all you want about toughness, but toughness isn't shouting. Toughness is standing in rooms like this one, day after day, hearing voices try to diminish you, dismiss you, silence you, and refusing to move. Toughness is surviving what you thought would break me." The words hung heavy, resonating beyond the walls of the studio. The audience wasn't just hearing a clapback. They were witnessing the unraveling of a persona that had gone unchecked for too long. O'Reilly tried again. Voice raised. "Congresswoman, that's not—" But Crockett didn't flinch. She cut clean through. "You had your time. Now it's mine." Her eyes narrowed, and then came the blow that sent a ripple across the room. "You say I don't know what I'm talking about?" "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about integrity. I'm talking about service. And I'm talking about the difference between building something for people and building something for yourself. You built a brand. I'm building a future." The crowd erupted. Gasps, claps, even a whistle or two. O'Reilly's face flushed crimson, his grip tightening on the desk like he needed it to anchor him. For once, his legendary dominance was faltering. Crockett didn't let up. Her words became scalpel cuts, each sharper than the last. "You made a career out of silencing women, out of cutting off anyone who dared to challenge you. But let me tell you something, Mr. O'Reilly. Those days are done. You don't get to shout us down anymore. You don't get to erase our voices, not mine. Not anyone's." Her cadence slowed now, each word deliberate enough to sink into the bones of every listener. "You can try to talk over me. You can try to dismiss me. But what you cannot do, what you will never do, is silence me." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by a surge of applause, scattered at first, then swelling into something undeniable. Even those who came to cheer O'Reilly were forced to reckon with the force standing in front of him. O'Reilly's mouth opened, searching for his familiar arsenal of dominance, sarcasm, scorn, interruption, but his voice faltered. His legendary bark had met an unmovable wall, and the cameras caught it all, the twitch of his jaw, the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the rare sight of Bill O'Reilly losing the room. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or pound the desk. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, hands folded calmly once more, and let the silence speak for her. The message was clear. The old rules didn't apply anymore. She had rewritten them. And then, almost as an afterthought, she delivered the closing strike. So the question isn't whether I'll answer you. The real question is, will you ever answer to the people you've spent your career talking over? The applause came again, stronger this time, echoing through the chamber, bouncing off walls that had once amplified O'Reilly's dominance. His smirk had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who knew the tide had turned. The cameras zoomed in on Crockett's face, steady, unflinching, resolute. For every person watching at home, the image was unforgettable. A young congresswoman staring down a media titan and refusing to yield. The duel was no longer even. The power dynamic had flipped entirely, and everyone watching knew it. But the story wasn't over. The next chapter would not play out in that room. It would erupt across screens, feeds, timelines, and trending hashtags. And as the applause slowly quieted, one line closed the scene, heavy with foreshadow. The internet wasn't ready for what came next. The clip hit the internet like a match to dry grass. Within minutes of the confrontation airing, timelines were ablaze. Twitter, now branded as X, was the first battlefield. Hashtags shot to the top of the trending list. To Crockett clapback, Jock silenced no more, Jock by O'Reilly. The replay looped endlessly, clipped down to the moment Crockett leaned forward, eyes steady, voice like a blade, slicing through O'Reilly's decades of dominance. Memes sprouted in real time. One showed O'Reilly's stunned expression next to a crumbling Roman statue, captioned, "Fall of an Empire." Another paired Crockett's line, "You built a brand. I'm building a future," with images of rising suns, clenched fists, and fireworks. TikTokers stitched the moment with dancing edits, reaction faces, and fiery commentary. Instagram reels painted her words across bold text, layered over hip-hop beats. By dawn, the confrontation was no longer just a political exchange. It was a cultural event. Crockett's delivery became shorthand for standing your ground, for refusing to be shouted down, for claiming space in a world that too often tried to snatch it away. Commentators scrambled to keep up. On cable news, conservative pundits clutched their pearls. This was a disrespectful ambush, one insisted, his voice rising with indignation. O'Reilly is a legend. That kind of personal attack crosses a line. But their outrage sounded hollow, drowned out by the chorus of others who couldn't stop replaying the moment. Progressive voices filled the airwaves with praise. What we saw was generational, one analyst said, eyes shining. This wasn't just Crockett versus O'Reilly. This was old media arrogance collapsing under the weight of new leadership. Online, the public leaned decisively one way. Comment threads overflowed with admiration. She said what we've all been waiting to say. This is why we need leaders like her. Fearless. Absolutely fearless. Even those outside politics chimed in. Musicians, actors, athletes, each shared the clip with their own spin. One NBA star tweeted simply, "Mic dropped." O'Reilly, meanwhile, found himself recast as a relic. The same bark that once ruled primetime now looked brittle, even pitiful, against Crockett's composure. Commentators noted the irony. The man who built a career on cutting others off had finally been silenced, not by louder shouting, but by a calm, unflinching refusal to yield. Crockett's words transcended the moment. Her line about toughness, that it wasn't shouting but surviving, was printed on T-shirts by the next morning. Grassroots groups adopted it as a slogan, posting graphics declaring, "Toughness is refusing to be silenced." Students quoted her in classroom debates. Organizers used her words in speeches. What began as a clash on stage had spilled into the bloodstream of public discourse. The confrontation crystallized a bigger narrative, America at a crossroads. The old guard of media giants and establishment voices, used to commanding the conversation, versus a new wave of leaders who drew power not from networks or institutions, but from authenticity, resilience, and the people who saw themselves reflected in them. And for those watching closely, the contrast couldn't have been sharper. O'Reilly looked out of touch, grasping at relevance. Crockett looked like the future, fearless, unapologetic, unwilling to let power define her worth. Cable hosts debated all night. Was this the end of O'Reilly's relevance? Was Crockett now the most formidable truth-teller in Congress? Some scoffed. Others declared it a turning point. But beyond the pundit chatter, the verdict had already been cast in the court of public opinion, because the people had decided. The clip wasn't just viral, it was historic. The hashtags weren't just trends, they were rallying cries. Crockett's voice had become something larger than herself, a banner for those tired of being silenced, ignored, or shouted down. And as the views climbed into the tens of millions, the narrative crystallized. O'Reilly hadn't just lost a debate. He'd become a symbol of the past. Crockett hadn't just won a moment. She'd become the face of what was next. But the most powerful part was still to come, not in the clash, not in the hashtags, but in how Crockett herself chose to frame the moment. Because for her, this wasn't about ego. It wasn't about scoring points on an aging media titan. It was about something bigger, something every person watching could carry with them. And that's exactly what she would make clear in the resolution. When the storm of applause, memes, and commentary began to settle, Jasmine Crockett stepped forward to reframe the moment. She could have basked in the personal victory. She could have claimed it as proof of her sharpness, her strength, her quick wit. But that wasn't her style, and it wasn't her mission. With calm clarity, she spoke words that widened the frame beyond herself. This wasn't about me. This was about silenced voices everywhere. The room shifted when she said it. What had seemed like a heated exchange between two individuals suddenly became a mirror for something far larger. Crockett wasn't just defending herself from O'Reilly's bark. She was speaking on behalf of every voice that had ever been talked over, dismissed, or told to sit down. She was reaching through the cameras to touch the millions who knew what it felt like to be interrupted, ignored, or erased. She explained it simply. Dignity matters more than arrogance. Courage weighs more heavily than intimidation. Shouting can fill a room for a moment, but truth has a way of echoing long after the noise dies down. The clip of her clapback had gone viral, but what she wanted to endure wasn't just the spectacle. It was the lesson. Crockett told her supporters, "I didn't stand my ground because I wanted a headline. I stood my ground because the people I represent don't get to walk away from moments like that. Every day, they're fighting to be heard, in classrooms, in workplaces, in their own communities. If I can't stand for them, then I don't deserve this seat." Those words resonated like a bell. They weren't the polished rhetoric of a media-trained soundbite. They were rooted in something deeper. It was a reminder that democracy is not about the loudest voice, but the most authentic one. That leadership isn't defined by who commands the microphone, but by who dares to tell the truth when it's hardest to speak. Her confrontation with O'Reilly became a parable, the clash of old arrogance and new dignity. One side relied on volume, legacy, and intimidation. The other relied on composure, courage, and conviction. And in that clash, dignity prevailed. The lesson rippled far beyond the moment. Students watching at home saw in Crockett a model of what it meant to answer cruelty with composure. Workers scrolling on their lunch breaks felt a surge of validation. They too had been interrupted in meetings, doubted in boardrooms, dismissed in conversations, and they saw in her a reflection of their fight. Activists recognized her not as a celebrity politician, but as a comrade in arms, someone carrying the fire they had been tending for years. Her story reminded America of something essential. The democratic spirit doesn't live in marble buildings or cable studios. It lives in people willing to push back against arrogance, no matter the odds. It lives in every moment where truth is spoken with courage. It lives in every leader who chooses service over ego, people over power. And as Crockett's words circled the globe, they carried more than just inspiration. They carried responsibility. She reminded her audience that courage wasn't reserved for a televised stage. Courage was something ordinary people carried into their own lives, standing up to a boss, defending a classmate, speaking out when others stayed quiet. Each of us, she said, has the power to choose dignity over silence. Her moral clarity left no room for doubt. O'Reilly had lost more than a debate. He had revealed the emptiness of intimidation. Crockett had gained more than applause. She had crystallized a lesson that people could carry into their own battles. The democratic spirit, she insisted, is not fragile. It cannot be drowned out by shouting, nor buried under arrogance. It breathes every time someone finds the courage to say, "I will not be silenced." And as long as there are voices willing to rise, democracy will not fall. Her confrontation was unforgettable. But her resolution was unshakable. Dignity will always outlast arrogance, and courage will always outshine intimidation. The stage may have belonged to O'Reilly for decades, but the future, that belonged to voices like Jasmine Crockett's, and the world knew it. That single moment, the clapback heard across the airwaves, wasn't just a rebuttal. It wasn't just a sharp exchange between a politician and a pundit. It was a turning point, a symbol. Jasmine Crockett's refusal to be shouted down became a rallying cry for everyone who's ever felt silenced, underestimated, or dismissed. Her words didn't merely dismantle Bill O'Reilly's bluster. They revealed the deeper truth. Dignity defeats arrogance. Every time, Crockett showed that composure can be stronger than volume, that courage can overpower intimidation, and that authenticity resonates louder than any scripted insult. But here's the bigger picture. This can't end as just another viral clip. The democratic spirit demands more. If Crockett's moment inspired you, it's because it carried something beyond entertainment. It carried responsibility. Her courage is only as powerful as what we do with it next. So here's the call to action. Don't let this moment fade into the endless scroll of the internet. Share it, talk about it, amplify it. Let it remind people that truth can stand firm even when arrogance tries to shout it down. And if you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's must be louder, if you believe dignity, courage, and truth deserve a bigger stage, then stand with us. Subscribe, share, and spread the word. Because the fight to be heard doesn't end here, and silence is never an option. Moments like these prove that leadership isn't about dominating a microphone. It's about speaking for the people who've been pushed aside. Crockett did her part. Now it's our turn. Raise the volume of dignity. Elevate the voices of courage. Together, we ensure that arrogance never has the last word.